Everyone for coming along tonight. It's my great pleasure to welcome Beatrice Steele here. Bea won a first-class degree in English at Exeter, followed by an MSc English course at Oxford. She's researched archives at Paragon Castle, which focused on the literary impact of the castle, and has a genuine interest in researching historical archives. Here at NLO, we were delighted to hear that she was awarded a collaborative doctoral award last year by the South Western Wales Doctoral Training Partnership for a 2-year PhD. And the project's titled Imaging the Heavens, the Scientific and Cultural Significance of the NLO Archive. Now, many of you will have heard the tale of our collection of spectral plates and lantern slides was rescued from builder's skip at Cambridge University by Dr. Elizabeth Griffin and transported back to the NLO by Bill Hitchens. Now over 100 years old, there have been several attempts to digitize our collection, but sadly so far without success, although we've made a useful start from some of our own members. John Ponsford had actually catalogued all the spectral plates, but there's been no detailed research or an analysis of the content. So all of us at NLO would be delighted to hear what Beatrice has so far unearthed, no pun intended. But she's going to focus on the archaeoastronomy of the NLO. Lockyer was very much a polymath. Not only was he a scientist and his spectral discoveries he made, but he was editor of Nature for many years, but he was also regarded as a father of archaeoastronomy. And so to tell us without any further ado about what she's found, we warm welcome to Beatrice. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming. This is a great turnout. I didn't expect so many people, so please bear with me. Today I'm going to start with a more kind of general introduction for anyone who may not be entirely familiar with the archives and my work. So my project focuses on the cultural and historical significance of the scientific archives here at the NLO, obviously. So Sir Norman Lockyer, he was born in 1836 and he became a very prominent figure in the landscape of Victorian science, most famous for his discovery of the element helium in the sun's atmosphere. And obviously this discovery was made using spectroscopy. Put briefly, this is the study of the absorption and the emission of light by matter, and Lockyer was a long-time proponent and pioneer of using this method to detect elements in space. The NLO archives contain many examples of Lockyer's spectral plates, which were the main means of recording these absorption and emission light of Victorians. So David, if you want to go to the first slide, show an example of that. So yeah, there you can see an example of spectral plate and of the lantern slide. So the plates are made of glass, and many of the most fascinating plates which record the spectra of all the available elements were made by Lockyer in conjunction with his friend, the chemist Edward Frankland. Lockyer also founded, as David mentioned, the incredibly influential science periodical Nature in 1869 and remained its editor until shortly before his death in 1920. This periodical played an important part in the popularization of science in the 19th century and is remembered for the famous names that contributed regularly to its columns, as well as the intellectual sparring carried out in its letters and news sections. As well as this, Lockyer published numerous works intended for amateur astronomers and fellow scientists alike. He originally resided in London and did his work at the former Solar Physics Observatory in South Kensington, but he eventually moved to Sidmouth in the early 20th century and built the Hill Observatory, which we're now standing in. So I'm not here today to discuss the spectral plates primarily, but rather I want to focus on the archives collection of lantern slides. The lantern slides are also made of glass and contain transparent images which were originally meant for projection. I think we will have a demonstration of these later. There are roughly 600 in the collection, as opposed to the 7,000 glass negatives and spectral plates. These lantern slides give us an extraordinary glimpse into the life of a scientist in the Victorian era, from eclipse expeditions in far-off places to family holidays to photographs of groundbreaking new telescopes. However, there is a subset of random slides, roughly 120 in total, that pertain to Lockyer's, one of his most controversial theories. They showcase his firm commitment to creating a reliable record of his studies. And whilst my project's main theme is the scientific coteries or groups of people that Lockyer engaged in throughout his life and as evidenced by the archive, I would like to talk today about the impact of controversies of his work in an academic field that is still marginalized today, archaeoastronomy. In assessing Lockyer's photographic studies of Britain, we can discover the extent to which Lockyer and his small coterie pioneered these archaeoastronomical methods and discover the exact role, it's a mouthful, the esoteric and folkloric played in the long neglected question of Britain's early cultures. Lockyer's records of his investigations in Britain seem to encompass both the empirical duty of documenting the outward appearance of an ancient site and the less tangible atmosphere of such a site. Next slide, please. So in 1890, Lockyer accompanied a friend on a trip to Greece and Turkey. He took this trip in the spirit of a tourist. Observing ancient sites such as the Parthenon inspired him more than the average sightseer. He immediately noticed that the Parthenon was built in what he called a curious direction, and his mind turned to the astronomical implications of this. On his return to England, he undertook reading on the subject and decided to visit Egypt, being the nation with the most documented and famous ancient temples. He had written to W.M. Flinders Petrie, excellent name, the leading expert on Egyptian archaeology, and asked his opinion on this idea that the temples and the stars were related. Petrie was intrigued, but approached the idea of temple orientation with caution, pointing out that some of the configurations may have been influenced by the local landscapes. Yet when Lockyer actually arrived in Egypt, the reception to his ideas was frosty. Not only had orientation been discussed before, but it had been largely disregarded. As the quotation in the title of this presentation suggests, Lockyer's sudden investment in ancient temples and their orientation raised a few eyebrows among Egyptologists, but the connections he had fostered throughout his career aided him. A well-off American friend lent Lockyer his river steamer so he could sail up and down the Nile, visiting the many temples on the banks of the river and measuring their orientation. Edfu, the second largest temple in the whole of Egypt, provided a watershed moment for Lockyer. An Egyptologist's friend introduced Lockyer to an inscription on the foundation of the temple, which contained the words, "I cast my face towards the course of the rising constellations. I let my glance enter the constellation of the Great Bear. I established the four corners of my temple." This inscription seemed to confirm the link that Lockyer postulated between the monuments and the stars, and he began to study ancient Egyptian culture closely, eventually coming to believe that the entire religious system of the time relied on the cosmos. Next slide, please. In the 1891 article in Nature, Lockyer writes the connections between ancient civilizations and their methods of worship. As well as Egypt and Greece, Lockyer displayed an interest in Indian and Chinese civilizations, and particularly in the observational technologies they utilized. Here you can see one example from the pre-telescope astronomy box from the NLO archives, and the similarities between the monolith depicted and the structure in this photograph from Dawn of Astronomy on the left. Many of these examples of pre-telescope astronomy actually belong to Norman Lockyer's son, William J. S. Lockyer, who was also an astronomer. What these slides and many others in the collection evoke is a deep sense of ancient mystery, and Lockyer himself appears to sum up the appeal of archaeoastronomy in his 1891 article as follows. If any of you will get from your public libraries any books on Egypt, I'm sure you will feel that it is not a question of knowing so little, it is a question of knowing anything at all. When one considers that at the beginning of this century, not a sign on any of these monuments was understood, and now the wonderful genius of a small number of students has enabled Egyptologists to read inscriptions with almost as much ease and certainty as we read our morning papers. This is what is surprising, not the fact that we as yet know so little, and in many cases lack certainty. It strikes me that you could make almost exactly the same statement about Lockyer's discoveries about the sun and the stars. The prospect of chipping away at the great unknown proved irresistible to his scientific curiosity. In 1894, Lockyer published many of the previously mentioned concepts in a book called The Dawn of Astronomy, which presented these findings in Egypt to a much larger audience. Of most interest to archaeologists among the book's claims was that astronomy could sort out the chronological controversy around the exact dates of the pharaohs' dynasties. It could do this by dating the monuments more accurately than by archaeological means alone. The dawn referred to in the title is the worship of the rising sun, which Lockyer argues inspired the beginnings of an interest in the cosmos and led to a formation of star cults. Yet Lockyer's theories about Egyptian monuments were not entirely novel, as the idea of dating temples by the position of the stars had been put forward before. The architect Francis C. Penrose is a pivotal figure in encouraging Lockyer's interest in Greek temples. On the results of an examination of the orientations of a number of Greek temples, very succinct title, I'm sure we can agree, Penrose recalls alerting Lockyer to previous work conducted on orientation in the 1880s by Herr Nissen of Bonn, who had approached the subject as a philologist. Penrose had studied a few inconsistencies in Nissen's measurements of monuments, and he thought he could be righted by Lockyer's scientific position. One 1892 letter found in Nature from H.G. Lyons, who later became the director of the Science Museum, shows early support for Lockyer's connection of the orientation of Egyptian temples with the heliacal rising of certain stars, by demonstrating that some modern Egyptian communities persist in a system of dating that originates from the astronomy of the ancients. So there are some substantiated accounts that supported Lockyer's theories about the existence of an abiding astronomical tradition. There is present in his work a deeper tendency to tie together Greek, Egyptian, classical, and even early British societies, one that originates from an Enlightenment desire to locate the root of all great civilizations. Varieties of this idea have been pursued by scientists before, most memorably and outlandishly Isaac Newton's attempt to locate the lost Solomon's Temple in Britain. Archaeoastronomers today are eager to point out that these mostly outdated theories of civilization were greatly influenced by prominent works on anthropology, such as J.G. Fraser's The Golden Bough, which is a wide-ranging comparative study of world religions. This also posits the theory of all monotheism and polytheism springing from the same source. Lockyer himself was influenced by French Enlightenment thought about the root of culture, and particularly by certain scholars such as Charles-François Dupuy, who explored what he proposed to be the relationships between Syrian, Persian, and Egyptian solar deities and the Christian gospel. The Dawn of Astronomy was received well and the product of Lockyer's continued interface with archaeologists, astronomers, Egyptologists, anthropologists, and works of folklore and mysticism. However, it was in his next work that, as Liz Henty puts it in her book, Exploring Archaeoastronomy, crossed a disciplinary line with archaeologists. Next slide. Lockyer remained invested in Egypt, but a pressing problem at home had been brought to his attention. He writes in the preface to his next book, Stonehenge and Other British Stone Monuments Astronomically Considered, one reason for writing the book was that in consequence of the supineness of successive governments and the neglect of wanton destruction by individuals, the British monuments are rapidly disappearing. The decay of Stonehenge is a point of contention for Victorians, and the tipping point came on the 31st of December 1900, when a storm blew down one of the outer triflons and its lintel. The triflon is kind of that rectangular structure there. So regardless of this, however, the most damage on Stonehenge had been inflicted by centuries of uncareful visitors, who would often bring hammers with them on their excursions to chip off pieces of the rock to have as keepsakes. Sir Edmund Antrobus, the nominal owner of Stonehenge, fenced off the site and began restoration work, charging visitors a shilling for his trouble. Lockyer supported this action, but Antrobus's campaign for preservation faced intense criticism, and eventually Antrobus was taken to court in 1905 by groups who wanted free access to the public at Stonehenge. Antrobus was, however, very keen on expanding the scholarship around Stonehenge and allowed Lockyer access to the site in order to study it and attempt a reconstruction of the damaged and fallen stones. This very expensive operation was overseen by Professor William Gowland, who was an engineer appointed for the job by the Royal Society. Lockyer chose one theory to explain the origins of ancient British monuments, which directly contradicted the prevailing mood amongst archaeologists at the time. Lockyer supported the idea that Stonehenge and Avebury, which is another stone structure, were in fact Druid temples, a view very popular back in the Romantic era of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. As Lockyer's biographer A.J. Meadows writes in his book Science and Controversy, the cult of pyramidology often included Stonehenge in their dubious pseudo-scientific theories, and as a result, archaeologists did not particularly want to entertain the extravagance of beliefs which drew upon Druid or Egyptian influence to explain British stone monuments. Antrobus was also a member of the ancient order of Druids, and held a large initiation ceremony in 1905, perhaps to send a message to those who thought of the monument as possession of all Britons, as opposed to Antricus's private property, which is how he viewed it. Lockyer's association with Antricus, as well as his honorary membership of the Welsh Bardic Gathering, or Gorsedd, could not have helped his reputation among serious archaeologists who were naturally wary of the spiritualists who were invested in British antiquities. If Lockyer thought that his assessments of the more obscure British artefacts would be less controversial in his work on Greece and Egypt, he was wrong. At least there was one more scientific reason, which meant that his measurements in Britain would be technically easier to carry out. Due to Britain's northerly latitude, this makes it possible to date solar-oriented structures more accurately than elsewhere. Of course, the main thread of continuity between Egypt and Britain is Lockyer's work, is his belief that the early societies of Egypt and Britain contained religious similarities, such as the cult of the star Alpha Centauri. As his friend Reverend John Griffiths illustrates, the Celtic languages of Britain were regarded as being derived from those of the pre-Celtic peoples. Linguistic peculiarities, such as beginning sentences with verbs and joining prepositions to pronouns, were found to not only be features of the Celtic tongues. In Lockyer's 1928 biography, Griffiths quotes Sir John Morris Jones, who argued that the non-Aryan traits of the syntax of our insular Celts point unmistakably to that of the old Egyptian and Berber, together with kindred idioms belonging to the southern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. This obviously echoed some of those contentious 18th century ideas about the origin of British civilization. Next slide, please. Lockyer approached British monuments with the same hypotheses as his earlier work on Egyptian temples, yet this time the much smaller and more antiquarian nature of British prehistory presented a new difficulty. Many of the sites Lockyer visited had not yet been properly surveyed since the famous antiquarian William Stuckley visited them in the late 18th century. Inevitably, Lockyer found himself revising some of the previously held truths about the positions of stone circles in temples and pathways, thereby meddling with the archaeological consensus. One such challenge to Lockyer's new characterizations of these sites was given in the pages of Nature by Mr. Goddard, who insists that if any weight is to be given to the statements and plans of Stuckley at the Devil's Den in Avebury, Lockyer must be wrong in his measurements. You can see the Devil's Den, that was on the previous slide. That was actually given its name by early Christians in Britain who wanted to brand pagan beliefs as satanic. Lockyer further challenged the perceived authority of archaeologists over these sites by publishing Surveying for Archaeologists in 1909. Yet the overwhelming reaction to Lockyer's work, aside from moments of spirited debate, which he was no stranger to, was radio silence. As John Michel points out, when prominent contemporary archaeologists did reference the idea of solar orientation, such as R.A.S. McAllister and Sir Mortimer Wheeler, all verged on the derisive when discussing the possibility. Gordon Childe, a famous and respected Marxist historian, could not bring himself to believe that our rude ancestors, ill-clad in the cold, misty climate of Northern Europe, would have cared to pass their nights studying the stars. When facing attitudes like this, it makes sense that Lockyer would rather have played into the 18th century antiquarians' desire to elevate the intellect of our rude ancestors by relating them to the lauded classical civilizations. Lockyer was different from archaeoastronomers who focused solely on alignments, because in both the Dawn of Astronomy and Stonehenge, he attempts to make inferences about star cults from his orientation studies. Even this more cultural focus did not appear to interest archaeologists. Lockyer's combination of archaeology and astronomy might have had a warmer reception if he had not lent so heavily on folklore and entertained the old theories on druids that so irked archaeologists. Meadows writes that the study of folklore had become more respectable during the 19th century, and indeed increased academic attention to the subject from people such as Jacob and Wilhelm Grill, most famously, had helped elevate its profile. Yet the company Lockyer kept prejudiced experts in British antiquities against him, and the wall of silence that increasingly met his ideas must have limited his research by more tightly circumscribing the circle of researchers with whom he could exchange views. I believe that Meadows' account of the controversy is correct in its essentials, but it is important to note that while some of these beliefs were extravagant, admittedly the idea of Stonehenge as a druid temple, along with many of other Lockyer's ideas about civilizations who used orientation, has been more or less discounted. Lockyer was not one to follow the crowd, and he was not generally a credulous person. His sarcastic reaction to the public panic around the observation of Martian canals on Mars in the pages of Nature is a good example of his resistance to trend and hysteria. Lockyer was a skeptical person, and this was the foundation for his passion for truth and on his road from an amateur to professional scientist. He was admittedly a strong promoter of his own theories, but abandoned them when provided with concrete evidence to the contrary. In his pursuit of archaeoastronomy, he invented a new empiricist discipline which combined magisterium and reached towards a more all-encompassing form of science. Outside of Lockyer's achievements, archaeoastronomy tells us about the earliest known attempts to understand the nature of human existence and its relation to the great unknown. Next slide, please. Archaeoastronomy is still regarded as a fringe subject in universities today, mainly because it's seen as not only resting on speculation, but potentially being in hazardous dialogue with New Age beliefs. The history of archaeoastronomy beyond Lockyer does indeed interact with New Ages very regularly, and in some ways they have actually gained societal precedence when we consider the stars. For instance, Giulio Magli makes the point in his recent textbook on archaeoastronomy that while most of us know our astrological sign, we do not often know where we would locate that sign in the night sky. However, we are certain of the relevance of the framework of shamanistic cosmology, i.e. the religion of the Upper Paleolithic and Neolithic eras, to archaeoastronomy. This is not to validate New Age or superstitious beliefs, but in order to gain the full picture of the past, astronomers and archaeologists have to be willing not only to work together, but to expose themselves to the slightly shadier avenues of folklore and esoteric belief, using the critical scientific method, of course. It would also be unfair to posit that the suspicion of esotericism and unwillingness to upend the established methods of investigation are all that prevent archaeologists from embracing archaeoastronomy to this day. This might make sense historically, but Henty points that the continuing marginalization of archaeoastronomy is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and archaeologists who wish to pursue astronomical avenues in their research will have trouble locating experts in orientation because of its niche nature. Less attention to astronomical cultures in archaeology means that the subject remains on the fringes, and archaeoastronomers are still very rare in university departments. Lockyer saw himself as an interdisciplinary man. He was a man of letters as well as a scientist, and indeed, to his mind, the two branching disciplines were not mutually exclusive or even distinct. His last work, co-authored with his wife, focused on the poetry of Alfred Lord Tennyson, his personal friend and an amateur scientist in his own right. As Lockyer writes of Tennyson, the moulding of the planet and of man was to him an unbroken record. As humanity is arguably the main force moulding the planet now in the Anthropocene, we can look back to the monuments of archaeoastronomy as the first tangible attempts to use mathematics and technology to comprehend the stars. Thank you.
Thank you, Bea. So what do you want? Do you want questions from the floor, or do you want to carry straight on into your lantern slides?
I guess if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, any questions on Zoom? We'll stop sharing now. Any questions either from the floor or on Zoom for Beatrice?
My only comment, it's a fantastic talk. Thank you.
Right, that's good.
Thank you.
I've got a question. This link that Lockyer believed the Celts and the Egyptians, is there any way with our current knowledge of tracing DNA connections through civilization we can make any, where did the Celts come from?
That's a very good question. Well, Lockyer and Griffiths was kind of very keen on pushing this belief that the Celts were basically an offshoot of the Egyptians that had migrated north and kind of set up their own temples and their own kind of vaunted rituals. And there's kind of a lot of politics behind that belief when you look at Griffiths, and because he was a member of the Gorsets, kind of Welsh Bardic meeting, and he was very keen on pushing kind of the Welsh national identity and Celtic identities more generally. And Lockyer got caught up in this kind of very kind of pro-Celtic, pro-classical civilization movement. But he also suffered because of that, because it meant he was associating all these druids and these kind of esoteric figures as well. So in answer to your question, I don't know where the Celts came from originally, but it's pretty much been entirely discounted now, the idea that there's this one root of all these civilizations, and everybody's kind of rising from that, and therefore the British kind of culture, which I guess has always been maligned by, I mean, if you read Caesar's early accounts of Britain, for example, you have him describing British people as barbarians. So it feels like a reaction against that. So yeah, I'm going to say that I don't know, but Lockyer wasn't correct on that. So yeah.
John.
Slide you had of Stonehenge. Was all those slides of Stonehenge, because it seems to be pre them reconstructing part of Stonehenge. Is that correct? Did
Yeah.
Lockyer begin that process at all of getting Stonehenge to look the way it does now? Or
yeah, so he was really involved in that, and the Royal Society came in with that as well. Antrobus was his personal friend, and he had kind of seen the disrepair that Stonehenge came into under his father, who owned it before him, because his father wasn't that impressed with Stonehenge and didn't really care about it. And so it was a bit of a free-for-all. And Lockyer was quite distressed by this. So Antrobus asked him, as one of the most famous astronomers in Britain at that point, and someone who had a real interest in British antiquities, he was pretty much asked to come in and, as I recall, help restore it to what it might have been. But then the Royal Society got involved, and it's quite interesting when you read the letters around this, because Lockyer did feel a bit sidelined after that, and after the engineers started coming from the Royal Society. Obviously Professor Gowland is the most famous one. So yeah, those photos are of before, like pre-reconstruction. So
what was one of those people Antrobus himself then?
it's quite hard to tell who's in the exact. So one I think you're referencing is one with the figures.
Yes, and there's
Yeah.
like a mini Stonehenge in the background, like a small version.
Oh no, that could have been Avery actually.
Oh,
Yeah. Sorry, I should have pointed that out. If you go back on the PowerPoint, I can.
Yeah.
Okay, hang on, we've got to,
Somebody wants a question.
Oh, someone's got.
hang on, we're sharing the screen again, going back,
Yeah, I can.
back.
This one.
Yes, it was that one there.
Yeah, that's called Avery. So that's the Devil's Den.
Okay.
So that's a different monument. But yeah, the person in that I did identify them. I can't remember his name, but he was essentially a local kind of member of the gentry who escorted Lockyer to that, and that's quite an interesting one as well, because there was a lot of pushback from early Christians against that monument in particular, because they really did believe that it was a Druid monument. So that's why it's called the Devil's Den, is that that's its colloquial name.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, so that's the long answer.
Okay, we have a question from Chris from Zoom.
Hello.
Hello there. Yeah, thanks for the talk. Superb. Sound's not very good, so I might have missed the answer if you've already said it. What constellations or stars were the Egyptians aligning to? Sirius, Orion?
I think there's a wide selection of that really. The one they kind of really focused on, which I mentioned, was Alpha Centauri.
Oh, okay.
One that Lockyer really thought there was kind of most of the cults revolved around. But as I recall, I think he there were numerous constellations that were addressed. So sorry, I can't give more specific answer than that, but there's quite a few in there.
Okay.
Sirius was a very significant star, because when they saw that rising in the blue sky at dawn at the summer solstice, it was a signal the Nile was going to flood.
That's right.
So that was the first day of their calendar when they saw Sirius twinkling in a blue sky.
That's right. And there are theories that the pyramids are aligned to Orion as well, too. Nebula.
Well, that's a fairly modern theory. Alan.
I wonder, what we think of the idea that really the establishment of archaeoastronomy was a matter of bad timing in some ways, because archaeologists were trying to establish themselves as a respectable branch of academic inquiry rather than a bunch of treasure hunters, etc. Norman Lockyer was already known as someone who had espoused a number of strange ideas, famously his meteoritic hypothesis, etc. And when he came along with his ideas, particularly once he started linking them with the folklore, type stuff, that it was a good excuse for them to despise it. Had he come up with these ideas a bit later, you know, about dead by then, of course, maybe 20 years later or something like that, by which time some of the other people who started getting involved, Scottish people whose name I've totally forgotten, it might have had an earlier respectability, do you think?
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, archaeoastronomy really flourishes in kind of the 60s because I think people were much more willing to accept a new discipline at that time. And it's very true what you say. Also, the association with antiquarianism, which was very controversial, even in the 18th century, there are lots of satirical cartoons of antiquarians as these kind of, you know, nutty old men who, you know, have too much money and too much time and aren't spending their time looking at the really valuable things from classical antiquity, you know, instead just in a field in Wiltshire digging up, you know, arrowheads or something. There's a lot of derision around that, and so I think archaeologists really they were fighting on two fronts really. So I would agree with what you say totally, because they were trying to say that actually this is a scientific discipline. It's not like the antiquarians of the 18th century. You know, we're not like them. But also they're fighting from the other way. I think these kind of folkloric, you know, Druid, kind of very, very pro-Celtic fringe people, who are the only other people really who are interested in British antiquities. But so yeah, it's a very interesting historical moment. Yeah, and I think archaeoastronomy now is having a bit of a renaissance. You know, there's quite a lot of stuff being published on it now. So yeah, if anyone wants to look into it, now's the time.
Do you think he's justified it, from what you've discovered so far and read? Is it a statement he's the father of archaeoastronomy? Is that a fair enough statement?
It's not an uncontroversial one, but I personally, I think it's quite accurate, because I think he did more to popularize it than any of the other archaeoastronomers. I mean, it had been quite fringe before, and as I said in the talk, Lockyer wasn't totally original in having this idea, but he did just, you know, really improve upon what existed before, and he brought it into a much more scientific realm, I think, than other people who just kind of suggested it. And particularly Dupuy, who I mentioned, who was an 18th century kind of French aristocratic intellectual. He has some very strange ideas about, you know, Christianity being related to solar deities, and then he just relates that to like a temple in Egypt to support it. And so I think Lockyer really pushed it into this realm of science, and I think for that he does deserve it.
Good. That's good to know. Thank you.
Did he do anything with Northern Europe, other than Stonehenge, like going into the Orkneys, and also perhaps northwest France as well? Significant stoneworkings in all of those places.
Well, he didn't. I don't think he went to France. I think he did get information from other people about northern France. I recall reading that. He did go up to Aberdeenshire to do some measurements, and he has illustrations of the Orkney Isles in the archives. So,
one of those lantern slides I recognise, having been there.
Yeah.
It's a map of the Ring of Broca and the stones of Stonehenge, and now that huge Neolithic temple they're excavating between the two stone circles.
Yeah. So he was in Scotland. Yeah.
His book on the British Age, when it came out, there were 2 editions of it. By the time the second edition came out, it had loads and loads of extra sites. And he used to get his various friends to go out on their holidays and do a bit of measurement for him. So it was pretty well scattered across the country.
He was. I think he even got measurements from Ireland, really all over. People sending him things. I think he even refers in Stonehenge to it as being kind of like a half holiday when he would go to these places. He did see it as a pastime as well, which I think is quite nice, really. He had a real passion for it.
So a message from Caroline Walter. Thanks very much for allowing me to tag along and listen to the talk. Please could you pass on to Beatrice that I'd be very interested to know more about her project with the slides and plates, and if any relate to the written archives held in the University of Exeter Special Collections. She can contact me by email on cwalter@exeter.ac.uk. So I think, yeah, Caroline has digitized a lot of the NLO collection that was in at Exeter. So thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Caroline. Yeah, we'll be in touch.
Hi. Fascinating talk, thank you. I was interested in your particular background because it's very, very much an English slant. So what drew you to astronomy?
Well, it's a bit of a crazy story because I did 18th century literature at Oxford and I did a master's in that. And then when I was choosing my PhD, I realised that actually I always had this interest in Victorian science. So I really thought I want to go back into that and do something with that. So I guess my work here is not so much, I mean, I engage with science quite a lot, but it's definitely more from kind of visual culture perspective, what I'm doing. And I'm trying to make my project conform to kind of, well, not conform to one discipline, trying to make it a bit broader than that. So yeah, and in this academic jobs market, that definitely helps. So yeah, that's the short answer, I guess. Yeah.
Right, okay, I think that's all the questions. We're going to switch now to the lantern slides. I'm very sorry you on Zoom won't be able to see our wonderful lantern slide projector because it's not a digital version. I suppose you could turn the camera on the screen.
Can you turn the camera on the screen?
Yeah, perhaps, Alan, you can turn the camera on the screen.
Don't know whether it's going to work or not.
So we can't guarantee the next stage is going to work, but we're going to point the camera at the screen. You may or may not have success. So, Alan, would you like to fire it up?
Unfortunately, it's only got a short lead on it.
If you just turn it on the screen. So you got most of it there, I think.
That's about it, really. Where are we?
Beatrice, what slides do you want?
I put them out on the.
If I,
Are we on?
yeah. This
I
is,
can't see it from here.
Some of the 600 are
Yeah.
that's it. I've got most of it.
Okay. Tip it sideways.
That's it.
Yeah, because it's going at an angle. Unfortunately, not enough lead on it.
Can you
Well, that's
see
best
that
we can
on
do.
Zoom?
Hang on, get the projector.
You need to turn the projector off, David.
Oh, right, okay. Right, I've got to turn the projector off.
Shall we?
Yeah, perhaps. Can you see a white square? Yeah, we've got a thumbs up from Chris. Yep. Yeah. Just putting the slides in the right way. They were upside down and back to front.
You've got to put them upside down and back to front.
So Robert Ball said there are 8 different ways to bring a lantern slide into projector, only one of which is right.
Strong remember of this.
So this is, we've got a slide of Stonehenge up. It's probably a bit overexposed. So you may or may not be able to see that on Zoom. So what date does that date from be? Any idea? Probably about 1890, is it? 1905.
Yeah, 3 in 1905.
So has Stonehenge changed much in the last 100 years?
You can't get close to it.
So just imagine that Norman Lockyer is behind the lantern.
Bits of woodwork are fighting back. Woodwork regular.
Yeah, that's Norman Lockyer.
I recognise the frame of Lockyer, but who's the other guy? Presumably that's Lady Lockyer in the background. Would that have been Antrobus or?
I don't think I could identify him. It's one of the unidentified. Most of them were just kind of friends who came along for a day out. So a lot of them weren't really famous scientists.
Says on the slide, May and November. Because anyhow.
That's an alignment.
So which site are we on here?
Wilson Magnet.
So that's Lockers Hill.
Oh, I was just going to say.
It's described as a cromlech in the centre, isn't it?
Yeah, that's
So where's Craddock North?
that's Wales.
That's
Well.
Wales.
No, it's not Wales. It's Carrot Hill, Cornwall.
Oh yes.
Oh, Cornwall.
It's in Cornwall.
In the corner. Says 1805 on the slide.
That was before the camera was invented.
You did well there.
Beautifully drawn.
All the ones you've given me. Yep.
So these old.
Interview last time, Jason, we went through.
Yeah. Around the world in 80 slides. How long's the candle last?
Get a bit warm.
It's a message to Janet Dowling. Are you using the real slides or photo slides or series of photos? I can't work out. These are the genuine article. These are the original lantern slides that Lockyer would have used in his talk. So these date back from 1890 onwards.
Do we know where this is?
That's Boscawen. Boscawen.
Cornwall, yeah.
I think it is.
Or is it the Merry Maidens? Might be the Merry Maidens in Cornwall.
Or it could be there, yeah. Pretty sure it's-
They evolved slightly over the century.
Yeah,
It's
Bit misty there.
yeah.
certainly different.
Yes.
Rather atmospheric there in the fog.
So the lenses on the projector did get clear this evening.
We believe you. It's not cheap,
Doesn't look like much holding that big stone up, does it?
the trees.
There was an interesting podcast by Melvin Bragg a few weeks ago on megaliths. Amazing structures, how ancient man lifted those big boulders up into position.
That's probably loaded off.
Yeah. Okay.
Would that have been Petrie?
I don't think so. I can't remember his name. I think it's something like Days or something like. He was a friend of Lockyer's. I didn't manage to find much record of him on that.
I don't know, Robert Mond, who was for later on the scene, but he was a keen archaeologist. Have you come any references to Robert Mond?
I haven't actually. He's not on any of the expeditions. So yeah, I'll have to try to find him.
That's cool. Yeah.
That's the heel stone, isn't
Oh, that's it.
It is.
Well, it's the rock in the foreground.
it? That's the heel stone. That's the famous one where you see sunrise at summer solstice.
Is it still there?
Oh, yes.
Okay, I don't remember being there.
We had in our student days, we'd have Stonehenge and the solstice sunrise, big poster. You must have seen that.
Okay. It's so long ago since I've been there.
Sure.
That's a nice one. Thank you.
Yes.
Closer to the sun.
There's a white cat against the stone. The white cat in there somewhere.
We're going to find it.
So yeah.
Thank you.
So, Beatrice, thank you very much. So we'll stop for a coffee break now for an hour, and then to our visitors and everyone else who'd like to join us, we'll give you a planetarium show in about quarter of an hour.
If they come to the hatch, I'll serve them with coffee if they want to.
Okay, so coffees are on Alan. So we're going to say goodbye to everyone on Zoom. This has been recorded, so if anyone wants the link for the recording, we will pass it on. Thank you, Bea.